Imagine a hidden British corner in China, not as famous as Hong Kong or Macau, but with a fascinating story all of its own. Weihaiwei, perched on China's northeastern coast on the Shandong Peninsula, was a leased British territory from 1898 to 1930. Today, it's part of modern China's Weihai city, but over a century ago, it was home to a curious mix of British colonial officials, Chinese soldiers, locals, and a tiny British community trying to make a home far, far away. In the late 19th century, Western powers and Japan carved up parts of China like a birthday cake. The scramble for China, as it was referred to, reflects the intense competition among foreign powers to gain territorial concessions and spheres of influence within China. This scramble followed the weakening of the Qing dynasty after military defeats and internal strife, which left China vulnerable to foreign encroachments. Different imperial powers sought control over strategic ports, railways and resources, often carving out areas where they could exercise political and economic dominance without outright colonization of the entire country. One notable acquisition was by Russia, which secured Port Arthur, now the city of Dalian, on the Shandong Peninsula, located around 300 miles east of Beijing and close to the modern border with North Korea. This warmer water port was especially valuable because it provided Russia with year-round naval access, unlike their ports in the icy north. Russia's presence there allowed it to expand its influence in Northeast Asia and challenge Japanese and British interests. Germany also made its move by acquiring Qingdao on the southern part of the Shandong Peninsula. Germany established a formal settlement there in 1898 after a series of aggressive diplomatic and military maneuvers. Qingdao became an important naval and commercial base for Germany, further extended European powers' control along China's coast. Japan's expansion was a direct consequence of its victory in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. By defeating China, Japan gained control of Taiwan and exercised growing influence over Korea, and it pushed further into China itself. Japan's ambitions alerted other powers, as its growing military strength and territorial gains threatened to upset the balance of power in East Asia. In response to the increasing influence of Russia, Germany and Japan in China, Britain acted strategically to protect its key commercial and diplomatic interests, particularly the vital routes to Beijing and Tianjin. Following Russia's lease of Port Arthur in 1898, Britain secured two leases, the first being the new territories in Hong Kong. This area, that makes up about 86% of modern-day Hong Kong, was strategic as modern weaponry could be launched on Hong Kong Harbour from the hills overlooking Hong Kong Island and the Kowloon Peninsula, so it was imperative that Britain had a buffer zone. Hence the lease of the new territories right up to what is now the border with Shenzhen. The second was a lease of Weihaiwei, an abandoned Chinese naval base opposite Port Arthur, as a defensive move to counterbalance Russian and later Japanese power in the region. Britain's lease of Weihaiwei was unique. It was tied to the presence of Russia, and subsequently Japan, being at Port Arthur, lasting only as long as those powers occupied the strategic port. Under diplomatic pressure, China reluctantly agreed, and on May 24, 1898, the British fleet took possession, establishing Weihaiwei as a British-administered port that symbolised Britain's effort to maintain regional dominance without outright annexation. Now, there were three main types of governance of British overseas territories at the time. Hong Kong, seen as a crown colony by the British, was formally acquired through conquest or cession, with treaties such as the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, and governed under colonial laws specific to its status. Crown colonies had established governments, a legco, and direct administration from the British Crown. Hong Kong's governance, similar to that of Sri Lanka or Malta, was structured with broader powers and more formal legal institutions, reflecting its importance as a major trading port and strategic territory. It's important to note that China has never seen Hong Kong as a colony of Britain, merely a sovereign territory of China governed and ruled by the British. In contrast, the Falkland Islands were governed under something known as the British Settlements Act of 1887, which applied to the British possessions acquired specifically by settlement where no prior government existed. This act allowed the British Crown to legislate for these smaller, less developed settlements through orders in council and letters patent. Such settlements typically lacked the more complex government systems of Crown colonies and operated under a more direct form of rule designed for remote or sparsely populated territories. Other such territories include Ascension Island, Pitcairn, and Tristan da Cunha. WEIHAIWEI, meanwhile, was governed under the Foreign Jurisdiction Act of 1890, which provided a framework to exercise British jurisdiction over foreign territories leased or ceded from other powers, often under treaty arrangements. WEIHAIWEI was leased from China with a stipulation tied to Russian control of Port Arthur, and its administration was somewhat unique, combining British governance with a degree of local Chinese presence. The Foreign Jurisdiction Act allowed Britain to establish courts, legal systems, and administration, even though WEIHAIWEI was not a full colony. This was still very much Chinese soil on a short-term lease, and for most part, Chinese governed the Chinese. Other places under this kind of unusual type of jurisdiction included British Somaliland in East Africa. WEIHAIWEI was never intended to be a bustling colonial-type city like Hong Kong. The British hoped to develop it as a naval base, but soon realised the harbour was too small for a major fleet after a Royal Engineers survey. Initially, the territory was under the War Office and administered by army officers, with a senior naval officer as a kind of overseer. The first military commissioners were Major General Arthur Durwood and Commander John Daintree. However, by 1901, the British decided not to fortify WEIHAIWEI as a naval base. Responsibility then shifted from the military to the Colonial Office. This change allowed civilian commissioners to be appointed who still governed with broad powers but without a legco, meaning more direct rule from the Commissioner's office. Meaning the Commissioner of WEIHAIWEI had more powers than the Governor of a British colony. Sir James Stuart Lockhart, one of the most notable commissioners, sought to develop Weihai into a holiday or health resort for British expatriates, but faced challenges including limited funds and uncertain lease terms. Now, Lockhart was a career colonial officer with decades of experience in China. He brought a calm, pragmatic approach and even changed the official flag. Initially, the British flag included the Qing Dynasty dragon, which Lockhart found inappropriate for British use. He replaced it with Mandarin ducks, a quirky symbol representing harmony and peace. This flag remained until the territory's return in 1930. Sir Reginald Fleming Johnston, the final commissioner, was famous for tutoring China's last emperor, Pu Yi. Under Johnston, WEIHAIWEI saw little change as Britain prepared to hand it back to China peacefully in 1930. Both Lockhart and Johnston were Sinophiles and spoke Chinese like natives. Johnston was said to have mastered the local dialect of the area and would be asked by locals to settle disputes. Both men had such a close relationship with the locals in Weihai that they received a bowl of pure water when they departed, in recognition of their honest and upright running of British WEIHAIWEI. Now, the leased territory covered around 285 square miles in a half circle around the peninsula, including a fortified harbour, a sheltered bay, and surrounding hills with many villages. Home to about 120,000 Chinese inhabitants, its strategic centre was Lugong Island, within the harbour, serving as a naval and administrative headquarters. Initially, local villagers, like those in Hong Kong's new territories, resisted the British occupation, leading to violent skirmishes with many Chinese casualties. It was ultimately a Chinese regiment within the British Army that suppressed the resistance. This resistance had mostly ended by 1903. Though primarily a civilian administration, a small British military force was stationed in Weihai, about 200 troops, alongside the 1st Chinese Regiment, known as the WEIHAIWEI Regiment. This regiment consisted of Chinese soldiers led by British officers, symbolising a blend of British military tradition with local manpower. During the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, the regiment was deployed to fight alongside international forces in northern China. It notably participated in the defence and relief operations around Tianjin, fighting against Boxer insurgents and helping to protect foreign legations. The regiment was praised for its military discipline, marksmanship, and effective action in heavy fighting. They engaged Boxers in several battles, including repelling attacks on the railway station and the south gate of the old city of Tianjin. Several members of the regiment received distinguished honours for bravery, including the Distinguished Conduct Medal. However, after the rebellion, the regiment was viewed by the British as an expensive force to maintain, leading to its disbandment in 1906. During World War I, as the Western Front devolved into a horrific stalemate, Britain turned to an unprecedented source of manpower: Chinese labourers from Weihaiwei. Recruited from 1916 onwards, these men were not soldiers but civilians, enticed by contracts promising steady wages to support their families back home. They were often misled about the dangers, believing they would be working in support roles far behind the lines. In reality, nearly 100,000 of these men, known as the Chinese Labour Corps, were shipped across the world to perform the war's most brutal and essential manual labour. Under the constant threat of shelling, they dug trenches, unloaded munitions, repaired railways, and cleared the mangled debris of battlefields, freeing up Allied soldiers for combat. Their contribution was immense, yet for decades their story remained a forgotten footnote in the history of the Great War, a testament to the global scale of conflict and the often overlooked sacrifices of non-European participants. Memorials are located both in Belgium and in Weihai today to remember the men who gave their lives in the conflict. So what did Weihaiwei look like? Well, it was broken down into three main areas. The main administrative area, known as Port Edward during the British rule, now Central Weihai, was where the government offices, shops, clubs and social life were concentrated. Port Edward, named after King Edward VII, Queen Victoria's son. Second, there was Lugong Island, offshore from Port Edward. This was the heart of military and naval activities. It housed batteries, barracks and docks, acting as the operational base that Britain had initially hoped to expand into a significant naval facility. It had initially been set up as a naval station by the Chinese in 1888, when it acquired 15 warships from Britain and Germany and began to build a modern navy in the period known as the Self-Strengthening Movement. Just off Lugong Island saw one of the greatest battles of the Sino-Japanese War, the Battle of Weihaiwei, which saw China's Beiying fleet destroyed, resulting in China seeking peace. The third and largest area was the surrounding rural countryside, which remained mostly made up of traditional Chinese villages, where life carried on without much interference. A fascinating contrast of quiet countryside living alongside a tiny British enclave. This was a 10-mile wide stretch of land that gave the British a buffer zone to defend Port Edward and Lugong Island from attack. Similar to the territories in Hong Kong, the boundary was not a physical barrier, merely a series of boundary stones demarcating the line where British Weihaiwei was governed from. Indeed, citizens were free to come and go across the border as they saw fit. Of course, this differed slightly from the border of Hong Kong and the mainland, as later on a hard border was built in the early 1950s, something that still stands today. Life carried on as usual for villagers in the countryside of Weihaiwei, apart from the fact that they were now paying taxes to the British instead of to the Chinese Qing dynasty. Most quarrels and disputes were dealt with by village headmen, and only larger issues and actual crimes would have had to have been dealt with by the British magistrates. Salt was a big industry in Weihai, as it used to be in Hong Kong. The salt fields of Shandong province area are a stunning sight for all who see them today, a mixture of all different colours. In addition to salt, various ore mining took place, and also in the early days, panning for gold. An agreement with Germany allowed only the Germans to build a railway in Shandong province though. Therefore, what minerals and industrial output Weihai could muster was never able to be transported around China on land by train. Another interesting similarity between Hong Kong and Weihaiwei was that within the lease agreements for both territories was the exception of a walled city. More like a walled village, both territories came with a walled area holding Qing government officials, which were allowed to continue to be governed by the Chinese. Both areas subsequently ended up being a hive of degradation and an asylum for all sorts of bad characters, with gambling, prostitution and drug dealing becoming rampant. The British described the walled city of Weihaiwei as an evil den of monsters. at one point. The history of the walled city of WEIHAIWEI is much older than its counterpart in Kowloon, Hong Kong. Dates back to 1403 during the Ming Dynasty. This square fortress with walls 30 feet high and 20 feet thick initially stationed soldiers protecting the trade routes in this part of Shandong province. In fact, the name Weihaiwei actually translates to something like military district. 2 prisons were located in the territory, one small one on the mainland and a larger one on Lugong Island. For those hardest of criminals though, they were put on ships and sent to Victoria Jail in British Hong Kong. Policing combined British officers and local Chinese staff to maintain order, a modest force reflecting the territory's quiet nature. An interesting story is that in 1922, the seaman strike fueled anti-British feelings and raised concerns about the loyalty of local officers in Hong Kong. To address this, the British officials in Hong Kong turned to Weihaiwei, recruiting Chinese officers from there who spoke different dialects and were seen as more reliable and less tied to local unrest. After the strike, over 100 Weihaiwei police arrived in Hong Kong, mostly deployed in the new territories to replace Indian officers reassigned to the city. Early on, these officers faced challenges adapting to Hong Kong's environment and discipline standards, with reports showing many struggle with misconduct and health issues like malaria. Despite a rocky start, over time they adjusted and became a stable part of the police force. Some officers and their families, like the father of former Hong Kong Chief Executive C.Y. Leung, settled deeply into the community. Interestingly, police officers' numbers on their uniforms in Hong Kong used to be preceded by a letter. Europeans began with A, B was for Indians, C for local Chinese, and D was for Shandong Weihai policemen. E, believe it or not, was for white Russians who escaped Siberia after the Russian Civil War. This history shows how the British police force strategically balanced ethnicity, loyalty and local politics to maintain control in a very complex colonial setting. Weihaiwei was dotted with British-style colonial buildings, residences with colonial architecture, government offices, post offices, churches and hospitals. The British built medical facilities that served both the British expatriates and some local Chinese, introducing Western medicine to the area. The first British post office opened on Lugong Island in September 1899, and a second followed on the mainland at Port Edward in 1904. Until 1917, Hong Kong postage stamps were used in Weihaiwei, after which Hong Kong stamps overprinted with China were adopted for mail in the territory. This system continued until the lease ended and Weihaiwei was returned to China in 1930. Schools mainly followed a British curriculum adapted for the local population, and education was a priority for the colonial officers, aiming to provide a blend of modern education with respect for local culture. Many schools were church-based, with both Catholic and Anglican schooling offered. Others, such as the Weihaiwei School, were strictly for European students. Famously, Commissioner Johnston brought back a scroll from the abdicated last Emperor Puyi to the government free school in Weihaiwei, the only free school set up for Chinese students in the Lease territory. Now, despite its small size, Weihaiwei had a lively social scene for its British residents, starting with the golf course, one of the earliest in China, along with tennis courts and cricket pitches. These sports grounds became hubs for Brits seeking a touch of home and relaxation after official duties. In the countryside, hunting with dogs also became popular, and horse racing also took place. Football became the most popular sport played by both the troops and the Chinese population in Weihai, with regular games taking place. Just outside the gates of the walled city, the Weihaiwei Golf Club emerged in 1902, and with another at the eastern end of Lugong Island being built years later, although this was exclusively for non-Chinese players. The course on Lugong Island is still visible today. On the water, sailing and other water sports were prevalent during the British era, and today Weihai is the most famous for its sailing. Residents also enjoyed garden parties and community events, which fostered a colonial town atmosphere, a quaint English resort by the sea, separated from mainland China by just a few kilometres. The King's Hotel was built possessing 80 bedrooms and attracting Europeans from all over northern China. It became the centre of high society and even had a swimming pool, tennis courts, and an ice-making room. Discovered during the Song dynasty, WEIHAIWEI also had hot spring baths. This encouraged visitors who believed the springs to have therapeutic effects to the territory, but were exclusively for the European population. The baths were built by the Japanese, who had more experience with building natural spring spas. A few hospitals were built during British administration, including the Civil Hospital and the Royal Naval Hospital, which provided vital healthcare standards that mixed Western techniques with localized understanding. It served the military, expatriates and local inhabitants alike, representing a rare blend of cultures working together in early 20th century China. In 1903, the Public Building and Health Ordinance was proclaimed, and the building of drain, tap water wells and public toilets was constructed. As a rural place, people tended to travel around by boat, horse and cart, or by walking. Although Lugong Island and the waterfront at Port Edward had asphalt paving as early as 1902, it wasn't until 1927 when the first cars and motorbikes arrived in the territory. WEIHAIWEI did not achieve the greatness of other British territories such as Singapore and Hong Kong. It was shadowed by larger ports in the area, and the short lease meant that investors knew it was pointless putting their money into a project that they knew had a shelf life. By 1930, with geopolitical realities shifting and the strategic value of WEIHAIWEI diminished, Britain quietly returned the territory to China on October the 1st. The handover was peaceful, symbolising WEIHAIWEI's role as a strategic placeholder more than a permanent British territory. The British left behind their buildings, flag designs and stories, but the territory seamlessly rejoined China's sovereignty, with Lugong Island leased briefly to the British for 10 years afterward until World War II intervened. WEIHAIWEI's story is one of an odd but intriguing chapter in the British Empire, an area leased just in case, lightly developed and governed quietly, blending military ambition, colonial administration and local Chinese culture. It wasn't a grand imperial capital, but a small outpost bearing witness to the area's great powers jostling over influence in China and the life of a tiny colonial community far from home. If anyone asks about WEIHAIWEI, they remember it as a Britain's secret northern China retreat, full of history, curious symbols like Mandarin ducks on the flag, early Gulf in China, dedicated Chinese soldiers serving under British officers, and a peaceful handover that closed this modest but fascinating story. And if you want to find out more about the city of Weihai and Lugong Island and what it looks like today, do subscribe to Coastal Explorers on YouTube, as this October I shall be making the trip up to Shandong province to document what historical delights are still on show. And I know it's one of China's most magnificent seaside resorts today. So do join and like and subscribe to Coastal Explorers. Thanks for listening.